As dawn broke on December 2, 1805, over the fog-shrouded fields off Austerlitz, Napoleon Bonaparte's silhouette loomed large. Behind him, his 68,000-strong army was ready to face 90,000 Russian and Austrian troops. The enemy called him the Corsican Fiend, and they were convinced they had him cornered. But Napoleon, ever the hunter, devised a master stroke. Feigning weakness, he abandoned the Pratzen Heights, baiting the Allies to surge onto the high ground. As the sun pierced the fog, his trap snapped shut. His reserves struck, splitting the Allied center. By nightfall, 36,000 Allied troops lay lost. The Third Coalition was shattered, cementing Napoleon's myth of invincibility. Austerlitz showcased the very best of Napoleonic genius, fueling the myth of invincibility that seemed to follow him wherever he went. In today's episode of the Infographics Show, we'll uncover the secrets behind Napoleon's tactics that left his enemies reeling, and the reasons why for so long he seemed utterly unbeatable. Act 1. The Formative Years. Napoleon Bonaparte stormed onto the stage of history like a force of nature, forging a path through chaos and reshaping Europe's destiny with an iron will. From the breathtaking victories in Italy to the audacious campaigns in Egypt, his military genius and unrelenting ambition crushed all who dared oppose him, leaving a trail of stunned and shattered empires. Napoleon first tasted victory during the Siege of Toulon, where his astute tactical mind forced British forces to retreat. But it was the Italian campaigns of 1796 and 1797 that catapulted Napoleon to new heights of fame and power. In battles like Arcole and Rivoli, he used swift maneuvers and surprise attacks to shatter numerically superior Austrian forces, paving the way for French dominance in northern Italy. These campaigns marked Napoleon as a military prodigy among France's more established generals. In 1798, he took his army to Egypt in a daring gamble for glory. Landing near Alexandria, he crushed the Mamluks at the Battle of the Pyramids. But the British, led by Nelson, annihilated his fleet at Aboukir Bay. Stranded in a foreign land, he turned adversity into opportunity, merging war and discovery before returning to France a year later. He found his home country in turmoil, the people once again dissatisfied with their revolutionary government. Arriving in Paris, he moved in the shadows, rallying allies in secrecy. On November 9th, he struck with military precision. He dissolved the government, silenced opposition, and declared himself first consul, the supreme ruler of France. The coup was a masterstroke of timing and audacity, transforming a discredited general into a political titan. France now belonged to Napoleon, and his vision of empire stretched far beyond its turbulent borders. In the early 1800s, Napoleon forged his legend through lightning campaigns and decisive victories. At Austerlitz in 1805, he shattered the Russian-Austrian alliance with flawless deception and timing. In 1806, he crushed Prussia at Jena and Auerstedt, annihilating its army in a single day. His genius lay in speed, unity of command, and unrelenting aggression. Just a year later, he struck again in Poland, defeating the Russian army at Friedland and securing peace at Tilsit. By 1810, Napoleon's dominance seemed absolute. His presence electrified his soldiers, who followed him as if invincible, while his enemies quaked at his name. Yet, even as his star soared, weaknesses began to form. Early life. Napoleon's journey to becoming one of history's greatest generals began far from any battlefield on the serene island of Corsica in 1769. Born into a modest, noble family as the second of 8 children, Napoleon spent his early years in Ajaccio, a town surrounded by azure waters, sun-soaked beaches, and rugged mountains. His childhood was marked by the unique blend of ambition and adversity that would yield a fiercely resilient character. He saw firsthand the struggles of a land torn between French and Italian influences. It was a complex reality that left the Corsicans, including the Bonaparte family, wary of French rule. Yet it was in France where Napoleon's ultimate allegiances would lay. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, was connected enough to secure his son's admission to the prestigious Royal Military Academy at Brienne in mainland France. At just 9 years old, Napoleon was thrust into a world of aristocratic privilege. He was immediately singled out for his thick Corsican accent and modest origins. Napoleon honed a sharp sense of pride and a fierce ambition to excel, despite ridicule from his peers for his fiery temperament and small stature. Unlike his wealthier, more polished classmates, Napoleon took his studies seriously. He was seen as intelligent yet reserved, absorbing military theory with a voracious appetite. He particularly enjoyed subjects that required precision and problem-solving skills that would become his forte. Life at Brienne was disciplined and unforgiving. The academy adhered to a strict curriculum designed to instill discipline in the future officers of the French army. Napoleon found solace in his studies, immersing himself in books on history, mathematics, and the art of war. Fascinated by the lives of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, he grew determined to carve out a place for himself amongst them. He would soon get his chance. Graduating from Brienne in 1784, he was admitted to the École Militaire in Paris, the foremost military academy in France. At just 15, he was among the youngest cadets in France. His sharp mind and intense focus helped him rise quickly through the ranks. Napoleon threw himself into the rigorous study of artillery, a meritocratic branch of the military that required precision, calculation, and deep strategic thinking. Despite struggling financially, his family could barely support him. His instructors marveled at his dedication. He poured every ounce of energy into mastering the technical aspects of artillery, which would later become one of his greatest strengths on the battlefield. Incredibly, he finished the artillery course at the École Militaire in a single year. It was an incredible feat considering only 3 of 58 classmates were younger than him. Known as one of the hardest courses at the school, it demanded intelligence and discipline, traits that would form the foundations of Napoleon's genius. By the time he completed his training, the winds of revolution were sweeping across France. Centuries of monarchical rule, nobility, and tradition were being challenged. For a young officer with exceptional skill and few connections, this upheaval was both a risk and an opportunity. France was soon embroiled in chaos, and Napoleon the outsider would find himself thrust into a position to prove his worth. A star ascending. The French Revolution and Siege of Toulon. Revolutionary fervor tore through the heart of France, shattering age-old institutions and creating a rare opening for Napoleon Bonaparte to seize his destiny. In Paris, the guillotine became a symbol of terror, with public executions becoming a daily spectacle. No one was spared. Men, women, even children were sent to their deaths on suspicion of treason. The September massacres of 1792 saw prisoners butchered by mobs, and the fall of the monarchy plunged the nation into chaos. In the countryside, peasants rose in revolt, only to be met with brutal repression. The revolution reshaped society, but for many it was an era of fear, suffering, and loss, forever altering the course of French history. While the revolution swept through France, Napoleon was just beginning his military career as a junior artillery officer. Fiercely committed to the study of war, he had struggled against the constraints of the old regime, where advancement depended on noble lineage and powerful connections. But now the revolution dismantled that old order, giving Napoleon the chance to rise. France suddenly needed leaders, and the aristocracy's grip on power weakened. The revolution's ideals of equality, fraternity, and liberty had opened doors for ambitious soldiers. This was a rare moment when skill and merit could outshine pedigree, a moment Napoleon was perfectly prepared to seize. As the revolution descended into the Reign of Terror, the young republic faced threats from within and without. European monarchies, fearing the spread of revolutionary fervor, formed coalitions to crush the fledgling French Republic. One of the most critical threats came in 1793 at the port of Toulon. It was a strategic Mediterranean city that had fallen into the hands of royalists who welcomed British forces to their aid. Toulon's fall threatened to give Britain a critical foothold in southern France and disrupt French control of the Mediterranean. For the newly established revolutionary government, Toulon became an urgent priority. This was Napoleon's defining opportunity. At just 24 years old, he was appointed commander of the Republican artillery during the siege of the city. It was a role that would allow him to showcase his technical skills and tactical imagination. The situation at Toulon was dire. The British Navy controlled the harbor, and French Republican forces faced the daunting prospect of attacking an entrenched, well-supplied enemy force. Yet, Napoleon quickly assessed the battlefield and identified a key vulnerability: Fort Leguiet, a hilltop position that controlled the entire harbor. If the French could take that fort, they could direct artillery fire onto the British ships and force them out of Toulon. Napoleon's plan was audacious. He faced immediate resistance from higher-ranking officers who doubted the feasibility of seizing the heavily fortified hill. But Napoleon's intensity and clarity of purpose won over enough support to execute his strategy. He directed his artillery with precision, organizing a relentless bombardment that weakened enemy positions. Over several nights, Napoleon led daring offensives, inching ever closer to the higher ground. His relentless drive and strategic insight earned him the respect of his men. The ragtag Republican forces found a renewed sense of purpose under his leadership. Finally, after weeks of grueling combat, Napoleon ordered an assault on Fort Leguiet. Under cover of darkness, his troops launched a surprise attack, seizing the fort and positioning the artillery to dominate the harbor. As dawn broke, the French guns roared to life, unleashing a punishing volley of fire on the British fleet anchored below. The bombardment was so effective that the British were forced to abandon Toulon, burning their ships in retreat. The city was recaptured. Napoleon's bold strategy had saved the day. The victory at Toulon was more than just a strategic gain. It was a turning point in Napoleon's life. His tactical brilliance had been proven on a grand stage. It was here where he caught the attention of high-ranking officials within the revolutionary government. In recognition of his achievement, he was promoted to brigadier general, an extraordinary honor for someone so young. But Toulon also gave Napoleon something more valuable than rank. It gave him a taste of his own potential. He had taken a seemingly insurmountable problem and solved it with audacity, resilience, and vision. For Napoleon, Toulon confirmed that he was destined for greatness. The siege of Toulon also deepened Napoleon's understanding of revolutionary warfare. Unlike the constrained conflicts of the old regime, bound by formalities and limited ambitions, the War of the French Republic carried a higher purpose. These were not just struggles for land and power, they were battles to defend the very ideals of the revolution. This brutal reality shaped Napoleon's approach to warfare. It instilled a relentless drive in him, a willingness to take risks that other generals would shy away from. The ferocity of which he fought for the Republican cause made him both feared and respected amongst his peers, and it set the tone for the legendary campaigns that would follow. Following Toulon, Napoleon's star continued to rise. He became known in political and military circles as a young general with unmatched skill and an uncanny ability to win against the odds. His promotion following Toulon marked the beginning of his meteoric ascent as he moved from campaign to campaign. Each victory added to his aura of invincibility. In a republic struggling to maintain order, Napoleon's successes were seen as proof that the revolution's ideals could triumph over the old world. Having tasted power and recognition, Napoleon began to imagine a larger role for himself beyond the battlefield. Toulon had shown him that he was more than just a soldier. He was a man of destiny, capable of shaping the course of nations. This sense of purpose would carry him well through his next set of challenges, and eventually into the very heart of French politics: promotion and growing reputation. After Toulon, Napoleon's career took off. His promotion filled his critics with envy and admiration alike. Soon, whispers began to circulate through France about the young, diminutive Corsican who commanded battles as if born for it. In fact, Napoleon stood just over 5 foot 6 inches, average height for the time, though the British later exaggerated his diminutive stature to cut down on his reputation. It didn't help that he tended to surround himself with his much taller elite guard. Napoleon was a man of peculiar habits. He famously slept just a few hours a night, often working late into the night and rising early. And like most Frenchmen, he loved good wine and coffee. He took hot baths to relieve his hemorrhoids. He had a volatile temper. He was an obsessive organizer, planner, and logistician. He was said to have been deeply superstitious, often carrying talismans and avoiding certain numbers, particularly 13. There were endearing traits in his undeniably complex character. He would memorize the names and histories of his soldiers, creating an aura of respect and even loyalty amongst his troops. Many men believed that they were truly seen by him, and this sense of connection, even in an army of thousands, added to his allure as an unstoppable force. His habit of personally leading troops into battle became legendary. He made himself a visible figure on the front lines, earning loyalty with his charisma. With the Italian campaign on the horizon, Napoleon was ready to step onto a broader stage. He wasn't just climbing the ranks, he was preparing to change the rules of war in Europe itself. Act 2. Napoleon's Rise. The Italian Campaign. As the revolution raged on, so too did Napoleon's prodigious rise into the upper echelons of the French High Command. In 1796, Napoleon was given command of the French Army of Italy, a ragtag force plagued by low morale, supply shortages, and treacherous terrain. They faced numerically superior Austrian and Piedmontese foes, well equipped for mountain warfare in northern Italy. Yet within a year, he would transform this force into a disciplined, high-spirited army, scoring a string of victories that reshaped Europe's military and political landscape. Napoleon's approach to warfare was unlike anything Europe had seen, and the Italian campaign cemented his reputation as a military genius. Arriving in Italy, the still largely unknown commander found a landscape tailored to his method of rapid, decisive warfare. Italy's rugged hills and narrow passes provided natural defenses, but they also suited his preference for overwhelming surprise. Napoleon aimed not just to meet his enemies head-on, but to outflank and encircle them. This style, later known as maneuver warfare, became one of his hallmarks. He didn't just seek to engage, but to target and overwhelm his opponent's weak points, isolating individual units and turning battles in his favor before his enemies could fully react. Napoleon's first major victory came at the Battle of Montenotte. He caught the Piedmontese forces by surprise and split their lines, driving a wedge between the Austrians and their allies. This tactic of dividing his enemies, breaking up alliances, and isolating his opponents was one of Napoleon's early innovations. It quickly became a calling card. His strategy forced Sardinia Piedmont to quickly seek peace, allowing him to focus on the Austrians. With one enemy removed from the field, he hoped to make quick work of the other. The Battle of Lodi further solidified Napoleon's reputation, both among his soldiers and his enemies. Here he faced the Austrian army entrenched behind the river Adda, relying on a heavily fortified bridge as their primary defense. Napoleon knew a direct assault was risky, yet he also recognized the morale boost that a bold victory would give his army. In a daring charge, Napoleon ordered his men across the bridge, facing cannon fire at close range. The intense attack overwhelmed the Austrian defenses, and his soldiers soon swept their enemies from the field. This victory elevated Napoleon to near mythic status. His troops soon began to refer to him as the Little Corporal, a term of endearment and respect. The Italian campaign wasn't merely about the battles won. It was about Napoleon's evolving style and mastery of psychological warfare. He understood that his soldiers needed more than food and pay. They needed a cause. The promise of spoils of war not only motivated his conscripted masses of men, but bonded them to him with unbreakable loyalty. Throughout the remainder of the Italian campaign, Napoleon refined his doctrine of massed artillery and rapid movement. He introduced the concept of concentration of force, amassing his troops at decisive points while keeping the enemy divided and off balance. His soldiers became accustomed to forced marches, allowing them to appear where they were least expected. At Castiglione in the summer of 1796, he used these principles to full effect, deploying his troops in a sudden, overwhelming pincered strike that forced the Austrians to retreat. One of his most celebrated victories in northern Italy was at the Battle of Arcole. After a previous defeat, Napoleon famously grabbed a flag and led his men across a narrow bridge under fire. It inspired them to press forward against the overwhelming odds. This single act of courage and symbolism captured the imagination of his army, striking terror into the hearts of his enemies. The battle itself may have been a bloody stalemate, but it proved that Napoleon's soldiers fought not just for France, but for him. Notably, the Italian campaign began to reveal chinks in Napoleon's armor. One weakness was his tendency to overextend his forces, a trait that would haunt him in later campaigns. In his desire to chase down fleeing enemies and push relentlessly forward, he often stretched his supply lines thin. While his speed and aggressiveness typically compensated for this, it was a dangerous habit to cultivate as the scale of his ambition and conquests grew. His ambition meant he often failed to prepare for the long-term consequences of his victories. In Italy, he was primarily concerned with the immediate defeat of his enemies, yet he underestimated the challenges of maintaining his newly conquered territories and securing civilian loyalty. This oversight foreshadowed his struggles to hold on to his overextended empire into the later years. Napoleon's treatment of the local Italian population foreshadowed the missteps that would later shadow his legacy. Initially celebrated as a liberator, he soon alienated many with his army's insatiable demand for resources. Incessant requisitioning, heavy taxes, and relentless treasure hunting to sustain his campaigns left a trail of resentment amongst those he promised to free. By the end of the Italian campaign, Napoleon had forced Austria into a signing of the Treaty of Campo Formio, a diplomatic coup for France. The treaty marked a turning point in European geopolitics, shifting power away from Austria and signaling the rise of France as a dominant force. For Napoleon, the campaign solidified his formidable reputation. He had defeated a powerful coalition using tactics that made him appear unstoppable. His victories in Italy were bold, audacious, and decisive. each adding to his myth of invincibility. The Egyptian Campaign. Napoleon's early successes transformed him into a national hero. His victories, brilliant as they were, earned him both allies and enemies. The political elite of revolutionary France, wary of his power, saw him a potential threat to their own authority. In 1798, after dazzling Europe with his victories in Italy, he set his sights on Egypt. It would be a strategic prize, one that would allow France to threaten British interests in the Mediterranean and its lifeline to India. In this conquest, Napoleon likened himself to a modern-day Alexander the Great, a man on a mission to sweep through ancient lands and bring them under French influence. Yet Egypt would prove a complex, unforgiving land, testing not only his strategic vision, but his adaptability and limits as a leader. Napoleon began his journey to Egypt with a sense of grandeur and mystique, secretly assembling a fleet and a force of up to 38,000 men and setting sail from Toulon. He moved under a veil of secrecy, eluding the powerful British Navy as it patrolled the Mediterranean. His forces landed near Alexandria in July 1798, but it wasn't long before his soldiers realized the reality of their situation. Egypt was unlike any battleground they'd ever encountered, with harsh deserts, diseases, and a foreign population deeply rooted in its own traditions and faith. One of the campaign's defining moments came shortly after their arrival, when Napoleon led his troops inland toward Cairo. En route, they encountered a massive Mamluk force, Egypt's fiercest warriors, at the Battle of the Pyramids. Facing nearly 6,000 fierce Mamluk cavalry, Napoleon formed his soldiers into tight, impenetrable squares, each with artillery positioned at the corners. This arrangement allowed his infantry to hold against the Mamluks' repeated charges, while the artillery devastated the attackers from a distance. The Mamluks' skilled horsemen, but less equipped with modern weaponry, were decimated as they drove forward. The battle marked a stunning victory. Yet for all his success on land, Napoleon's campaign began to unravel at sea. Just days after the triumph at the Pyramids, his fleet was destroyed under the British Admiral Horatio Nelson at the Battle of the Nile. The loss was catastrophic, stranding Napoleon and his army in Egypt. Cut off from reinforcements and resupply, Napoleon displayed a remarkable ability to rally his men. He refused to show despair, instead framing their predicament as a glorious isolation that would lead to greater triumphs. He doubled down on his ambitions, declaring Egypt the new foundation of a French empire that would stretch across Africa and Asia. This charismatic confidence, even in the face of apparent disaster, kept morale intact and earned him the fierce loyalty of his troops. Napoleon's fascination with Egypt extended beyond the battlefield. Unlike previous generals, he showed a deep interest in the land's culture, history, and science, bringing along a team of scholars, engineers, and artists. This Commission of Arts and Sciences was tasked with cataloging Egypt's ancient wonders, marking the first significant Western attempt to systematically study the country's heritage. Among the campaign's discoveries was the Rosetta Stone, a slab inscribed with Greek and Egyptian scripts that would later unlock the mysteries of hieroglyphics. Napoleon's decision to bring scientists and scholars showcased his appreciation for knowledge and culture, a stark contrast to his image as a relentless conqueror. For Napoleon, the Egyptian campaign wasn't just about conquest. It was about civilization, about the fusion of military might and intellectual discovery. He saw himself both as a warrior and an enlightened ruler, a visionary bringing light to a land he believed to be shrouded in ignorance. Predictably, Napoleon's arrogance clashed with the local population. He tried to portray himself as a friend of Islam, even printing pamphlets in Arabic and making gestures to win over local leaders. But his efforts often fell flat, coming across as superficial and even patronizing. One notable incident involved his soldiers defacing a mosque in Cairo, triggering fierce local backlash. Napoleon responded with force, ordering a brutal crackdown that quelled the rebellion but left a deep resentment among the Egyptian people. This episode highlighted a critical weakness in Napoleon's leadership: his tendency to impose his will without fully understanding the cultures and the people he sought to control. As the months wore on, the campaign's challenges multiplied. Disease, particularly the plague, ravaged Napoleon's army. Supplies dwindled, conditions were bleak, but Napoleon maintained discipline through sheer force of will, making ruthless decisions when necessary. In one infamous episode during his campaign, faced with dwindling supplies and the burden of caring for prisoners, Napoleon made a chilling decision. After a grueling battle at Jaffa, he ordered the execution of hundreds of captured soldiers. He also attempted to bolster morale with an ill-fated invasion of Syria, hoping to strike at the Ottomans and break out of Egypt. But the expedition was a disaster, marked by fierce resistance, heavy losses, and a brutal retreat. At Acre, Napoleon's forces suffered a rare and humiliating defeat, failing to breach the city's fortifications. It was a blow to his reputation, a stark reminder of his own mortal limits. The Egyptian campaign ultimately ended with Napoleon's hasty departure in 1799. Sensing that France was on the verge of political collapse, he left his exhausted army behind, returning to France to seize power. Though he framed his exit as a strategic withdrawal, many of his men felt abandoned, left to grapple with a hostile land and an uncertain future. The campaign left a mixed legacy. Napoleon's vision of a French empire in the East lay in ruins, but the scientific discovery and cultural impact were profound. Becoming emperor. Napoleon's ascent to Emperor of France was as swift and audacious as his military ascent. By 1799, he had returned from the Egyptian debacle to find France mired in political chaos. The ruling Directory was corrupt and ineffective. The people, tired of revolution and instability, were searching for a leader strong enough to restore order and reinvigorate the nation. Sensing an opportunity, Napoleon orchestrated a coup, seizing power and declaring himself first consul, a move that effectively placed him in command of France. Over the next few years, he skillfully consolidated his authority, transforming himself from a general into a ruler who would reshape the nation and the continent. In 1804, Napoleon took the ultimate step, crowning himself Emperor of France. Shocking his allies and adversaries alike, the act was a spectacle of calculated symbolism. Rather than having the Pope crown him, Napoleon took the crown and placed it on his own head during his coronation. It was a bold act that declared that his power stemmed from no one but himself and the will of the people of France. But Napoleon's ambitions didn't stop at titles and ceremonies. He had a vision for France, one that would extend far beyond the battlefield. One of Napoleon's most enduring legacies was the Napoleonic Code, a comprehensive legal framework that he introduced in 1804. Before the Code, France's legal system was a patchwork of regional laws riddled with inconsistencies and privileges that favored the aristocracy. Napoleon sought to change this, crafting a system based on equality before the law, personal property rights, and secular governance. The Napoleonic Code abolished feudal privileges, reinforcing the revolutionary principle that all men were equal in the eyes of the law. It established clear legal standards that protected property rights and ensured that contracts were honored, though it restricted some rights, especially for women, who were seen as more dependents within the family structure. The code brought order and predictability. It gave France a unified legal structure that remains influential to this day. Napoleon's reforms weren't limited to the law. He enacted sweeping changes across France's society, reshaping institutions and infrastructure to build a stronger state. Napoleon established the Bank of France, a cornerstone of economic stability that provided a reliable currency for the nation. This reform not only restored confidence in the French economy, but it also laid the financial groundwork for his sweeping political and military ambitions. Recognizing the need for skilled administrators, he created the lycée system, a network of state-run secondary schools aimed at training future civil servants and military officers. This system was based on merit and experience, allowing even those of modest backgrounds a path to advancement. The educational reform cemented Napoleon's support among the middle class and gave France a reliable pipeline of competent, loyal administrators and officers. Napoleon also pursued religious reform, famously negotiating the Concordat of 1801 with the Pope. The Concordat re-established the Catholic Church in France, but on terms that favored the state. Catholicism was acknowledged as the religion of the majority, yet the Church operated under Napoleon's watchful eye, with clergy effectively becoming state employees. This arrangement placated religious conservatives without alienating secular revolutionaries, further solidifying Napoleon's support base. The Concordat was a diplomatic coup, demonstrating Napoleon's knack for balancing opposition forces and securing loyalty without sacrificing authority. Yet, Napoleon's reforms were not without controversies. His approach to governance was authoritarian. He controlled the press tightly, curbing freedom of speech and imprisoning political opponents. He centralized power to an extreme degree, placing loyalists in key positions and dismantling Republican institutions that threatened his authority. Though he had risen on the revolutionary principles of liberty and fraternity, he often sidelined those ideals in favor of order and loyalty, consolidating a personal regime. To Napoleon, stability and loyalty to his rule were paramount, and he made no concessions where his authority was concerned. Despite his autocratic tendencies, Napoleon's rule brought a period of stability that France hadn't seen in over a decade. His reforms revitalized the economy, strengthened the state, restoring a sense of unity and purpose to the nation that had been fractured by years of revolution and civil strife. Napoleon's empire extended these reforms to the territories he conquered, introducing the Napoleonic Code across Europe and reshaping entire societies. While many Europeans resented his dominance, Napoleon's legacy of meritocracy, legal equality, and secular governance left a lasting impact on the continent. In the end, Napoleon's rise as emperor was a blend of revolutionary ideals and imperial ambition. His reforms modernized France, leaving a legacy that went beyond military victories. Napoleon saw himself as a man of destiny, driven not only to conquer but to reshape society itself. For a time, it seemed he would succeed, bending France and Europe to his will. But as his empire expanded, so did his ambition, and with it the seeds of his eventual downfall. Crushing coalitions, Napoleon's European conquests. In the years after his coronation as emperor in 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte unleashed a whirlwind of military campaigns that left Europe breathless. As each coalition emerged to challenge him, a formidable alliance of Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, Napoleon methodically dismantled them. With tactical brilliance and revolutionary strategies, this was the golden age of Napoleonic warfare, an era defined by swift, decisive battles, unmatched logistical precision, and Napoleon's unparalleled mastery of the battlefield. Napoleon's first major test as emperor came during the War of the Third Coalition. At Austerlitz in 1805, Napoleon faced the combined forces of Russia and Austria. Outnumbered, he feigned weakness and lured his enemies into a trap. When the Allies overextended, he launched a devastating counterattack, obliterating their center and capturing 30,000 troops in the process. The following year, he turned his attention to Prussia in the War of the Fourth Coalition. At Jena-Auerstedt, Napoleon showcased his mastery of maneuver warfare. Using speed and deception, he destroyed the Prussian army in a single day, with over 24,000 casualties inflicted, compared to just 12,000 of his own. The campaign was a display of operational genius, marching his armies faster and farther than his enemies expected, outflanking them before they could unite. Within weeks, Napoleon occupied Berlin and temporarily dismantled Prussian military power on the European continent. Napoleon's strategic brilliance wasn't just about raw aggression, it was also about reshaping the battlefield itself. He pioneered the corps system, dividing his forces into semi-independent units capable of rapid movement and concentrated attack. This allowed him to strike hard and regroup faster than his enemies could react. His Grande Armée could march over 30 miles a day, helping him outpace and outmaneuver his foes. In 1807, Napoleon clashed with the Russians at Friedland, using classic Napoleonic tactics of envelopment and annihilation. With 80,000 men, he overwhelmed 58,000 Russians, pinning them against the Alais River and inflicting 20,000 casualties. The victory forced Tsar Alexander I to ask for peace, culminating in the Treaty of Tilsit, which reshaped Europe's balance of power. At its peak, Napoleon's empire rivaled that of Alexander's Greece and Imperial Rome, stretching from the Iberian Peninsula to the borders of Russia. Napoleon's military style evolved significantly throughout those campaigns. While he initially relied on the shock and speed of swift, decisive battles, he soon refined his approach, mastering combined arms tactics. By seamlessly integrating cavalry, infantry, and artillery, he transformed his forces into a cohesive and highly adaptable war machine. His use of massed artillery concentrating firepower at key points broke enemy lines with terrifying efficiency. His logistics system, though stretched, kept his armies fed and mobile, while his charismatic leadership inspired unmatched loyalty. His personal troops, the fabled Grognards, were battle-hardened veterans with a decade of combat experience who could march for weeks and still deliver a ferocious assault. The War of the Fifth Coalition in 1809 tested Napoleon again, this time against Austria. At Wagram, a two-day slugfest involving over 300,000 troops, Napoleon demonstrated his ability to adapt. Outnumbered early on, he reorganized his forces and unleashed a brutal counteroffensive, securing a hard-fought victory at the cost of 40,000 casualties on both sides. It was a bloodier campaign, signaling a shift in Napoleonic warfare. His battles were becoming more attritional as his enemies learned to counter his maneuvers. By 1812, Napoleon had crushed 5 coalitions, fought over 60 battles, and redefined the art of war, yet his weaknesses were growing more and more apparent. His belief in the invincibility of his Grande Armée remained unshaken. But as he prepared to march into Russia, Napoleon was about to face his most catastrophic test yet: an icy premonition, the Russian campaign. Napoleon's fateful decision to invade Russia in 1812 marked the beginning of the end for his empire. The campaign, known as the Grande Armée's disastrous Russian campaign, was an ambitious attempt to bring the Russian Empire under French influence. At the time, Napoleon commanded an unparalleled military force of over 600,000 soldiers drawn from across his empire. What he saw as a strategic necessity, however, soon became a staggering logistical nightmare that would ultimately destroy his military dominance. In June of 1812, Napoleon led his forces across the Niemen River, officially beginning the invasion of Russia. Napoleon's strategy was built on rapid advances and conclusive battles, but Russia's vast terrain defied Napoleon's tactics. The Russians avoided direct confrontation, opting instead for a scorched earth strategy. They traded space for time, withdrawing deeper into their own territory, burning villages, fields, and supplies as they retreated. The summer heat, limited food, and constant Russian harassment wore down the French soldiers. By the time Napoleon reached Smolensk in August, the Grande Armée had already suffered massive losses. Some estimates suggest he lost 100,000 men from disease, starvation, and skirmishes alone. Despite the hardships, Napoleon pressed on to Moscow, hoping to force a climactic battle that would end the campaign in a decisive victory. The battle came at Borodino in September, where nearly 130,000 French soldiers met over 120,000 Russians in one of the bloodiest fights of the Napoleonic Wars. After a brutal day of combat with nearly 70,000 casualties combined, Napoleon claimed a costly victory but failed to break the Russian spirit. When he finally entered Moscow, he found the city empty, its residents evacuated. Fire soon engulfed the city, depriving Napoleon of winter quarters and supplies. As weeks passed with no surrender from Tsar Alexander, Napoleon realized he could not maintain his position in Moscow. In October, he ordered a retreat. It was the beginning of a nightmare. Temperatures plummeted as the brutal Russian winter set in, dropping to -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers lacked winter clothing and sufficient food, and morale disintegrated. Horses died in droves, their carcasses littering the path back west, and the exhausted soldiers struggled through deep snow and icy winds. Starvation, hypothermia, and disease swept through the ranks. Cossack riders and Russian regulars constantly harassed the retreating army. The Grande Armée dissolved from within, with thousands of soldiers deserting or dying each day. By the time they had reached the Berzina River in November, the army had dwindled to a fraction of its original size. The crossing at the Berzina was the campaign's final brutal chapter. With bridges hastily built under enemy fire, thousands drowned or were killed in the freezing waters. When Napoleon's shattered force finally crossed back into friendly territory, fewer than 100,000 of the original 600,000 remained. The Grande Armée had lost over 500,000 men. Napoleon's empire had not only lost its best troops, but also its aura of invincibility. The Russian campaign exposed his worst vulnerabilities, revealing that even the greatest general could be defeated by nature, distance, and miscalculation. Napoleon returned to Paris with a tarnished reputation and an empire on the brink of collapse. The Russian campaign marked a major turning point in his life and reign. In attempting to subjugate Russia, Napoleon had overreached and stretched his resources to the breaking point. But more importantly, it showed the world that even he could be defeated. The shattered Grande Armée marked the end of his once unassailable image and emboldened his enemies across Europe. In the years that followed, his coalition of adversaries would grow stronger. Sensing that the French colossus was finally vulnerable, Napoleon's ambition had driven him to the edge of the world and left him with an empire that would never recover. Act 3. The Fall of Napoleon. Exile and Return. Napoleon's exile to the Isle of Elba in 1814 marked a bitter low for the Corsican emperor. The Russian campaign had shattered the might of his Grande Armée, and the subsequent military failures across Europe led to a renewed wave of coalition powers rising against him. The once immense empire he had forged was crumbling. After his disastrous retreat from Russia, Napoleon's enemies rallied, with the British, Prussians, Austrians, and Russians encircling France. By early 1814, Paris itself had fallen. Napoleon, now facing realization that his empire was lost, was forced to abdicate on April 6, 1814. His exile to Elba, a small island off the Italian coast, was as much a prison as it was a sanctuary. For Napoleon, Elba was a humiliating reminder of how far he had fallen, from emperor of the French feared across Europe to an exiled monarch in a remote corner of the Mediterranean. The terms of his abdication allowed him to retain the title of emperor, albeit over the tiny island of Elba. Napoleon quickly set about rebuilding his new dominion, modernizing the island's infrastructure, and even establishing a small military force. In these isolated surroundings, he carefully watched the political winds back in France, planning his inevitable return. Europe, meanwhile, rejoiced in his fall from grace. For the first time in years, the continent was at peace, and the Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII was restored to the French throne. The old aristocratic order seemed to have won, but the restoration was far from secure. The French people, tired of the turbulence that had followed the revolution, began to grow disillusioned with the new monarchy. The new king, Louis XVIII, was seen as weak and out of touch, unable to manage the fractured politics of post-revolutionary France. Rumors swirled that Napoleon might return, and return he did. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba with a force of around 1,000 soldiers and even more followers. He sailed back to France, landing on the southern coast near Cannes on March 1st. Word quickly spread that the emperor had returned, and the country seemed to awaken. Napoleon's supporters, many of whom were veterans of his old campaigns, rallied to his side. The path to Paris was a triumphant march, with towns and cities falling in line as his loyalists swelled his ranks. Even some of the royalist troops sent to stop him defected. It was clear the myth of Napoleon's invincibility was alive. The king, Louis XVIII, fled the capital, and on March 20th, Napoleon entered Paris for the second time. Welcomed like a hero, cheered as the savior of France. For the French people, Napoleon's return was nothing short of miraculous. He was no longer a villain in their eyes. He was the embodiment of French greatness, the man who had brought the country to the peak of power and pride. His return to power, though brief, was a testament to his enduring charisma and the deep connection he had forged with his countrymen. Napoleon, a villain to Europe, had become a hero to France once again. But the tide had already turned against him. His brief return to the throne would come to be known as the 100 Days, a last desperate attempt to reclaim the grandeur of his former empire. The rest of Europe, however, was not so forgiving. The reaction to Napoleon's return was swift and united. A new coalition of Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia quickly mobilized against him, determined to end his reign once and for all. Napoleon, now facing the might of Europe's armies once again, prepared for what would be the final catastrophic showdown of his career. The stage was set for the Battle of Waterloo, a battle that would determine the future of Europe and the fate of Napoleon Bonaparte. Waterloo. Smoke hung heavy over the battlefield as cannon fire thundered, shaking the ground beneath the boots of the Imperial Guard. Napoleon's elite soldiers, the fabled grognards, marched in unflinching squares toward the British center, bayonets gleaming in the fading light. The air was thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder and the cries of the wounded. These were the moments Napoleon lived for, where strategy gave way to raw determination, and the fate of Europe teetered on the edge of a musket barrel. But this time something was different. The enemy line, instead of shattering, stood firm. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, was the culmination of over 2 decades of war. Returning to France and rallying his supporters for one last bid to reclaim the empire, Napoleon faced the Seventh Coalition, a united front of European powers determined to end his reign once and for all. Commanding the coalition forces were the Duke of Wellington for the British and Gebhard Lieberecht von Blücher for the Prussians. These two veteran commanders understood Napoleon's playbook and were ready to exploit any mistake he made. Napoleon's army, though far smaller than the forces lined up against him, still had the speed, coordination, and discipline that had once crushed enemies across Europe. His strategy was simple yet aggressive. He aimed to defeat the Allied armies separately before they could unite. Dividing and conquering had been Napoleon's signature move, and he believed that with swift action he could shatter this Anglo-Prussian coalition. But Waterloo was not like Austerlitz or Jena. The battle fought in the muddy fields of Belgium would expose the flaws in Napoleon's over-reliance on tried-and-true tactics. The French emperor had divided his forces with the intention of defeating Wellington's troops before Blücher could intervene. Yet Napoleon misjudged the timing and the coordination required between his corps, a fatal error that would come to haunt him. Napoleon's first mistake came with the delay of the attack. The heavy rain the night before turned the battlefield into a quagmire. Napoleon, ever the perfectionist, hesitated, waiting for the ground to dry before committing his full strength to the battle. This gave Wellington's forces time to entrench themselves on the formidable position of Mont Saint-Jean, a ridge that provided a defensive advantage. Napoleon's artillery, which had once been the key to his victories, struggled in the mud. Meanwhile, his infantry, forced to trudge through the mire, were exhausted before the first shot was even fired. At the heart of Napoleon's strategy was his reliance on the Imperial Guard, the elite corps of veteran soldiers that had carried him to so many triumphs. He believed they were invincible, a force that could break any line, and he held them in reserve for the final push. But when the moment arrived, the Guard faltered. A series of miscalculations and poor coordination left them exposed to a devastating counterattack by British and Dutch forces, aided by the Prussian reinforcements under Blücher. Napoleon had failed to break Wellington's lines in the early hours of the battle, and when Blücher's Prussians arrived on the battlefield, the situation became dire. Napoleon's forces, already stretched thin, could not cope with the combined might of the British and Prussian armies. The Battle of Waterloo became a rout. Napoleon's soldiers, disheartened by the failure of his strategies and leadership, began to retreat. The once unbeatable emperor found himself surrounded, his dreams of empire slipping away with every step. In the aftermath, Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo was the result of a perfect storm: miscalculations, battlefield friction, and the relentless pressure of an overwhelming Allied opposition. His once unshakable confidence blinded him to the evolving dynamics of modern warfare. Even the use of large-scale combined arms tactics, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, was insufficient to break the cohesion and the discipline of the Allies. The battle laid bare a harsh truth: the tactics that had triumphed against the fractured European coalitions were powerless against the determination of a united front. His over-reliance on the Imperial Guard, once his trump card, had become a symbol of his downfall. For Napoleon, Waterloo was more than just a military defeat. It was the loss of his empire, his legacy, and his reputation. The myth of invincibility that had surrounded him for over a decade was shattered. Napoleon's downfall at Waterloo was not just a personal tragedy, it marked the end of an era for France and the world, signaling the collapse of one of history's most brilliant and tragic military minds. Conclusion: Waterloo marked the definitive end of Napoleon Bonaparte's reign and his once legendary military career. Following his defeat, Napoleon attempted to flee to the United States, but the British intercepted him. He was forced into exile on the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he would spend the last years of his life in isolation. With his dreams of an empire in ruins, Napoleon, once the master of Europe, was now a prisoner of war, a figure of history rather than legend. Napoleon's fall was not just a military defeat, but the unraveling of the myth of invincibility that had sustained his reign. For years, his brilliant strategies, audacious tactics, and ability to inspire loyalty had made him seem unstoppable. Yet his overconfidence in these very tactics led to his downfall. The Russian campaign of 1812 exposed his vulnerability to forces beyond his control. Waterloo laid bare the limits of his military genius in the face of a united coalition of powers. Napoleon failed to adapt to the shifting nature of warfare, clinging too closely to the strategies that had once brought him triumph. His reliance on past successes blinded him to the changing landscapes of European alliances and the resilience of his enemies. Napoleon's greatest strength ultimately became his greatest weakness. His refusal to concede when faced with mounting pressure led him to make reckless decisions that resulted in disastrous campaigns. His inability to adjust his strategies to new circumstances left him vulnerable, and when the forces of Europe finally united against him, his fate was sealed. In the end, Napoleon's untimely demise on St. Helena was a tragic end to the rise and fall of one of history's most remarkable figures. His invincibility was shattered by his own hubris. The very traits that had made him a hero to France now made him a villain in the eyes of the world. Though he died in exile, Napoleon's legacy would endure, but not as the invincible conqueror he once seemed, but as a cautionary tale of brilliance, ambition, and the inevitable limits of power. Now go find out why you wouldn't survive in medieval times, or click on this video instead.